Okay, welcome everyone to this live stream, Socialism for the Crisis, a System to Save the World. Tonight's forum is being streamed from Wurundjeri land. We acknowledge that it's taking place on Aboriginal land that was never ceded, that was stolen, and that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So tonight's forum is being hosted by Socialist Alternative. I'll be facilitating it. My name's Sarah, and this forum's part of a series of forums that have been happening every Sunday night and will continue to, where we look at the main questions being thrown up by this crisis, as well as a series of more general topics from a Marxist lens. So our speakers for this evening's panel about socialism are Lily Campbell, who is the Environment Officer at Sydney University. Hi, Lily.
Hello.
Hey there. And also Daniel Taylor, who is the editor of Red Flag newspaper and who has featured on one of these forums before. Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
Cool. Okay, so Lily and Daniel are going to talk tonight about everything to do with socialism, what it is, what it isn't, and how we get there. After the forum, there's going to be Zoom discussions taking place in many of the major cities across Australia, and these will enable you to ask further questions, to debate any of the concepts that are discussed on the forum tonight. So I'd really encourage people to go along to those and be part of those discussions. So the links for all of those Zoom discussions will be displayed in the video description. Okay, well, let's get straight into it. So I think the natural place to start is to talk about why now? Why does the moment we're in right now raise the question of socialism? I think the effect of any crisis is to throw up questions about the existing ideology, the existing structures that govern society, and to open up debate about how society could look differently, how it could be transformed, and so on. And I think the crisis we're currently in is certainly one of those moments. The old world has ruptured, and there's now a contest going on about what the new world should look like. So I think that's a good place to start. What is it about this crisis that for you guys points towards the need for socialism? Maybe let's start with you, Lily.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sarah. I think the coronavirus crisis for a lot of people has been exposed as like a very unnatural one. It's very obviously produced, has been incubated by a system that is so driven by this irrational and really criminal logic of profit that just dominates the whole world and really is like a motor, I guess, at the heart of capitalism. And like the most obvious example, which is just on the news every day, is this desperate scramble that's going on around the world for like the most basic medical supplies, like masks, let alone ventilators, gloves even for, medical professionals. And I think like one of the things that is enlightening, but maybe not to socialists, is that medical equipment is produced not because it's, made to save people, but is produced because it makes a profit for a pharmaceutical company or a medical technology company. And these companies, just like every other company, are always looking to cut costs, make more money. And that means they've built a whole system of, market production and distribution around what is going to save the most money. None of them have stockpiled because, stockpiling doesn't make you any money, cuts a lot of profit out of it. So if billions of masks got produced, it would actually help the world, but it wouldn't help these companies. And so it's never going to happen. I think that's a pretty criminal element of the system right now.
Great. Daniel, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I think that creates a really interesting situation, I think, and a pretty important one for socialists, for anyone involved in politics, but especially for socialists, because you've had this situation all around the world where for decades there's been neoliberalism based on the argument that one way or another the market is the best way to organise society. So that's been undermined a little bit in the last few years, but by this crisis it's just been totally destroyed. There is no way you can argue that the free market, the profit motive can handle this coronavirus crisis. Even the most extreme neoliberals are unable to mount that case seriously. So that whole way of organising society, organising the global economy is going to have to go, and it's going to get replaced with something different, something new. Everyone agrees that after this phase of the crisis, the other side of it, there's going to be something different there. And the question is, what's it going to be? And there's going to be a lot of big fights about that. I think in every country in the world, there's going to be a major battle about what kind of world is going to get created on the other side of it. You can see, Scott Morrison just said the other day, yeah, it's going to be different. It's going to be even more pro-business than what came before. He said we're going to have to create a super pro-investment, as he puts it, pro-growth, pro-business environment. So huge austerity is going to try and throw everyone, back into a more extreme version of austerity and neoliberalism than what you got before. But on the other hand, there's going to be a big argument, I think, that there needs to be more state intervention into the economy. We need to bring back national manufacturing, things like this. Possibly we need to nationalize things. And that's going to mix together with, realizations that a lot of people are going to have out of this crisis, that the world has to be way more equal. And it's got to be based on the fact that we've all recognized that, people like nurses, teachers, shelf stackers, cleaners, whatever, these are the most important people in society, yet they get treated like shit and exposed to all these dangers. So I think we want to, socialists have to be a part of this fight about what's going to get created, because there's going to be a strong case to make that we're going to need a society after this that isn't based on the profit motive, isn't based on the free market, but also it isn't based on nationalism, national states. It's an internationalist society that's based on the working class actually being in power, not the profit motive. And that's that really radical worldview that Marxist socialists have been talking about for a long time. Now, because of the nature of this crisis, looks like the only thing that makes sense. So we've got to be in the fight that's going to come.
For sure, yeah. Well, let's go into a bit more detail about what that type of socialist society would look like. If you're just tuning in, we're talking about what socialism will look like and how we'll get there with Daniel Taylor and Lily Campbell. And if you're interested in finding out more about Socialist Alternative, more about our events and our politics, get involved by clicking the link that will be coming up on the screen now. And come along to more of our forums. We also have weekly discussion groups. Well, actually they happen 3 times a week, where you can discuss all sorts of aspects of Marxist theory in small discussion groups. So if you'd like to sign up for those, the link to those is in the video description of this event. Okay, so let's get into a bit more detail about what socialism looks like. Socialism is something that is often quite ill-defined. It's a concept that means many, many different things to many different groups of people. It's something that for hundreds of years, people have fought very hard for, people have fought for with their lives. On the other hand, plenty of others have fought to discredit socialism, have spent most of their lives polemicizing against it. It's something that you find discussed in all corners of society, from the darkest places on the internet to most campuses. It'll come up for most people during their studies at some point. It's often disparaged in the mainstream media, and it's been a feature of working class communities in country after country for centuries. So what exactly is socialism? Lily, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think socialism is a pretty rational alternative to the kind of anarchy that we're seeing in capitalism at the moment. Another thing that I think the kind of crisis is exposing is the importance and centrality of class under capitalism, and the potential for there to be a totally different society without all of the parasites that do no essential work whatsoever. Under capitalism, the working class or the majority produce everything, make the entire world run. But at the same time, we're denied any control over how anything is run under capitalism. And I think that's because there is just this tiny minority of parasites, very non-essential people, who have control over the means of production because it is that they own things. And I think in order to keep hold of this quite unequal set of relations kind of at the core of capitalism, they create all kinds of structures and institutions of repression to keep us all down. And that is kind of the world that we live in. But socialism would just be like a radical reversal of like both this set of relations, but also like the abolishment of all of the institutions that they've set up to keep this very uneven kind of dynamic in place. So it would involve collective democratic control over production. And that is just simply possible because we do all the work everywhere anyway, which I think the crisis has really shown. And I think from that kind of control over production, people running their own workplaces, people starting to take back cities, run the world for themselves, distribute things how it is that they need to, you could reshape the whole of society according to human need and principles of justice. And I think we've seen kind of like glimpses of what that could look like in a bunch of struggles that have broken out around the coronavirus crisis. I was reading this article in Red Flag by one of my friends about how there are GE, General Electric factories in America who have started to demand and gone on strike to demand that they produce ventilators instead of, you know, useless crap that General Electric normally produces. And you can see that if it were the case that working class people had democratic control over their own lives, the world would just be a much better, much more liberating place. But also it would be rational. It wouldn't be the case that we're producing, you know, Ferraris, Mercedes-Benzes and microwaves in a time when these factories could be geared towards, you know, solving a bunch of the problems that we face right now.
Absolutely. Were there things you wanted to talk about with that, Daniel? More about democratic control of society by the working class. It's sort of something that can seem a bit of a mystery to people, I think. It's something that we're so far from today. So what exactly would that mean logistically and politically for workers to control society?
Yeah, and it's kind of what Marxism is all about. It's what Marxism is famous for. It's that kind of socialism that's about workers' control of the means of production. And really, it's about taking that basic logic of what Lily talked about, you know, workers fighting in the workplace to have more of a say over how wealth is produced and how their lives are organised and how the day at work is organised, so that the profit motive or the needs of their bosses isn't what decides, you know, do they have to do something unsafe, something that isn't socially useful? Are they building a jet engine for a US warplane? Are they building a ventilator for a sick person? Taking that process, starting at the level of a workplace, starting at the level of a factory or an office or whatever, and actually linking it up so that workers at the level of cities, at the level of whole countries, actually at the level internationally, are able to do that same exact thing together, you know, collectively discuss and decide how are we going to use the machinery that we know how to use, the skills that we have, how are we going to use that in the interest of humanity instead of the profit motive. We've got all the technical skills to do it, we've got all the technology to do it, we're just not allowed to do it because the rules of society are that, you know, people that own the factories decide what happens in them rather than people that do the work. And one of the really exciting things about what's happening now, it's a scary time in a lot of ways, but it's exciting as well because more and more we're seeing that kind of action, that kind of worker action, collective struggles in the workplace to say we want to produce in accordance with our values, our desires, our needs, not the market. So it's not just fighting for better wages, although that's really important, not just fighting for better conditions, that's really important. It's about saying we want to use this factory, this workplace to produce things that matter for human beings. And if you can have a society where that's the only thing that decides, then that's socialism. That's the difference between socialism and capitalism, if it's going to mean anything. And I think if you look at it that way, you know, okay, so Scott Morrison, you know, has a big, a really important dream, and he wakes up tomorrow, he's totally changed his mind. He says, I've lost faith in the free market. Government's going to take control of all the key industries and we're going to run it that way to get through the crisis. That still wouldn't be socialism. That would be the Liberal Party in charge of every factory, in charge of every office, in charge of every workplace. That isn't an emancipated, liberated society that can deal with this crisis, can deal with global warming, anything like that. That means if we're going to get that workers' power internationally, it's going to have to be built out of those struggles from below. And that means, I reckon, part of the task of socialists in the coming period is we're going to have to say, well, yep, there's an emergency. Yes, there's a crisis. That doesn't mean they can clamp down on our right to strike, our right to organise, our right to engage in political discussion, our right to argue about what kind of society should exist. Because the more people like this create a sense of an emergency, the more they're going to make those arguments as well, that workers shouldn't be able to go on strike in key industries, that, you know, that would endanger society. Actually, workers organising themselves in the key industries is the only thing that's going to save society now. So that's something that we're going to have to really fight to defend and to encourage. And it's part of what in Socialist Alternative we always try to bring attention to when it happens around the world. Like we were saying, we write about it, we publish on it. It's also something that we practically try to organise, you know, in the trade unions and so on, where our members are employed in different industries.
Yeah, well, I certainly think the very strong state intervention that's happening in this country and countries the world over is points to some interesting issues for socialists to grapple with, because it's the most commonly held idea of socialism, I think, that what it consists of is centralized state control of the economy. But that is actually something that conflicts with the description of socialism that Lily and Daniel have just given, but it's also something that's being doled out in spades right now because of the crisis. So we're seeing the state bail out industries, bail out companies to the tune of billions and billions of dollars, far bigger relief packages than were ever handed down after the GFC in 2008, and we're only a short way into this crisis. So there is heavy state intervention going on at the moment, but I think it's a far way away from anything that we would call socialist. So yeah, I'd be interested in looking into that a bit further, because I think it's something that is being discussed a lot at the moment. Is state bailouts tantamount to socialism? Is it a step in the on the road towards socialism?
Yeah, well, one of the issues with it is that, you know, we can talk about the limitations of the state taking over industry, but we're not even at that point yet. You know, they're trying to prop up not just capitalism, but they're trying to prop up individual capitalists, some of the most useless capitalists, like people that you semi-privatize your tram system, like in Melbourne, or your buses, or your rail, or whatever, and you let these corporations run it, even though it's, you know, something that they've got a total monopoly over, because it's formerly a state-owned thing that's necessary service that's just been handed over to these private corporations. Now no one's able to go on them pretty much, because you might die if you go on it. So no one's buying the tickets, the companies aren't making profits, but they get bailouts so that they can keep making a profit from running an empty tram, running an empty bus, running an empty train. That's obviously ridiculous, and that should just be taken, you know, under state control immediately. For whatever, that's not socialism. At least it's not just shoveling money into the pockets of capitalists that are literally providing nothing useful right now. And that's been the case with a whole lot of the state intervention, is that it's stuck at the level still of what obviously Scott Morrison and people like him prefer, which is just propping up not even just capitalism, but propping up individual capitalists, paying businesses to, you know, hibernate, as they put it, basically just hoping that if there's no logical way for the market to allow these people to exploit people and make profits, the state will just allow them to simulate it by giving them the money directly. It's totally absurd. The one positive thing about it is that it shows how absolutely nuts the political priorities of the people in charge are, and how almost any other way of organising society would be more rational. That's one of the problems straight away with all this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that backs up the idea that like more state intervention, or a major thing that backs up the idea that more state intervention is socialism, is still the enduring legacy of the Soviet Union and countries within its orbit. But really, like, Stalinist Russia had nothing to do with socialism. It was just like a capitalist regime that was consolidated on the back of the defeat of socialism, really, and the workers' control that was established after 1917. And this was just kind of geared around exploitative, competing with the West, and they needed to just reinstate a lot of exploitative practices in order to do that and be able to kind of build up their economy. I think like basically everyone counterposes free markets and big states and says that like socialism is like a policy proposal, and that big states on the one side is more left and freer markets on the other side is more right wing. And pretty much every kind of social theorist or economic theorist kind of backs up this dichotomy and advocates really for like a balance of like one kind of over the other, I guess, which is like the better way to run the economy and society. But it's like really a false dichotomy. In reality, capitalism has just always relied upon the state in kind of different forms in order to back up like various different means of running capitalism. And sometimes there can be differences in like the degree of autonomy that the state grants to markets, the kind of shape or the way that it is that the state intervenes in markets and capitalist relations. But at every point in all of these societies, the role of the state, the purpose of it, is to kind of back up the long-term viability of continuing to make profits wherever it is, wherever you are. And I think that means that socialism is not about like altering the state, changing the state, taking on the state in order to kind of run it in a nicer way. it means getting rid of the state because it's an instrument of class rule. So for like the USSR, it was like useful for them to kind of have a centralized dictatorship as a way of like, you know, consolidating their profits. For the US, the kind of better way of running things is lowering corporate taxes at the same time as having like an enormous incarcerated population. Different strategies, really a similar outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has been really disorienting that in so much popular discussion, capitalism is just understood as the free market, when in fact, like the free market is an ideological argument that you know, neoliberal pundits make. But neoliberalism has seen an expansion of the state, just mostly not in the areas that we would support, but rather in, as Lily pointed out, expanding the prison industrial complex, surveillance, all sorts of punitive sections of the state. But yeah, there's never been some clear distinction between weak states in the West, where the market reigns, and strong states elsewhere. The state's always been a key feature of how capitalism works, and I think that that's something to be clarified now for socialists, because I think we're going to increasingly see the state play a role in politics as they try and fumble their way out of this crisis and rebuild the economy as well. Okay, well, why don't we move on now to discussing some more left-wing versions of socialism that revolutionary socialists would have dispute with. So I think one of the key one really is social democracy and also democratic socialism. They're not interchangeable, but they're both on a continuum, and they're both about seeing parliament and parliamentary change as the vehicle for saving the world, rather than the things that we've talked about thus far, workers' control and so on. Why don't we start with discussing Bernie Sanders? Bernie Sanders has been, I guess, one of the most popular proponents of the parliamentary road to socialism. He's become a household name for left-wing people the world over. So why don't we start with his vision of socialism and how it stacks up against ours? Daniel, did you want to come in on this? I know you've written quite a lot about it recently in Red Flag.
Sure, yeah. Sanders is a really interesting guy. Probably the most famous individual self-described socialist in the English-speaking world, at least. I think when you talk about that approach to socialism, one of the first things to say is there used to be, and you know there still are in some cases, people who had a real parliamentary road to socialism, in the sense that they said, let's form a socialist party, get a majority elected, form the government, and then we'll actually abolish capitalism through parliament. And there's a debate between them and revolutionaries about whether that would work. Sanders doesn't even say that. Even though he says he's a socialist, he doesn't actually say that he's going to abolish capitalism. And in that sense, I think he's not a socialist really in a meaningful sense. It definitely is important in America. It's a very right-wing country that, you know, it was very controversial that he used the term to describe himself and whatever. But in terms of what he's actually describing, he said, I think, you know, I'm for socialism like Denmark. Now, you can make a good case that in many ways you'd be better off living in Denmark than in the United States for a number of reasons. But Denmark is not a socialist society. Denmark is not organized according to some fundamentally different logic. Workers don't rule in Denmark. It's not a classless society that's transcended the logic of the profit motive and created some different way of humanity relating to each other and nature. It's just, you know, you could equally say, I think society should be socialist like Australia, in which case, if you're a socialist and you're in Australia, you basically got nothing to do, mission accomplished. You can sit back and take it easy, which I don't think is right, because there's a lot of problems in Australia. And if Sanders got in and had been able to pass all of his reforms, this would not have prevented any of the major crises of capitalism that we're talking about, whether it's the imperialist rivalry between the United States and China, which could potentially lead to a war. Well, none of the reforms Sanders proposed would have really ameliorated that. Climate change, that's so baked into the logic of capitalism that if the United States had better healthcare, that'd be good for people in America, but it wouldn't stop capitalism barreling towards climate change. In fact, even a lot of the problems associated with this virus, as long as America is organized, as long as the world is organized on that basis of class division, dividing people into the exploiters and the exploited, you're not going to be able to solve this problem. So in that sense, what Sanders was talking about was reforming capitalism, not actually getting rid of it. And I think there's no point really using the word socialism unless you're talking about having a society where human beings are in control of themselves collectively and we're not coordinated by the profit motive in capitalists. And I was reading, it's good to look at the classics sometimes. I was reading some of the writings of Trotsky. He's a good guy, had a lot of interesting thoughts, good stuff to offer. And he made a nice point in one of his writings that I was reading. To paraphrase, he basically said it can seem unlikely that human beings will be able to reorganize their society totally outside the profit motive. You can think the best that you could hope for is have a better government, more humane government, get some reforms in, whatever. But if you don't think human beings are capable of that, then you don't believe in human beings at all. You'd have to say they're worse than animals, because animals can't reorganize their society either, but at least animals don't exploit each other. I mean, look at all of the things human beings are capable of, you know, the artistic achievements, the scientific achievements, the technological achievements. Surely we can reorganize society on that level as well. We can really, you know, apply that creativity, that sense of humanity and purpose to how we organize our whole world. It's just that currently the people that run society won't let us do it. So I think that's a very different vision than what someone like Bernie Sanders talks about, which is reforming important questions, some of them, important policies, things that you could support, but not getting rid of the basic logic of society that's led us to this crisis that the whole world's in now.
Lily, did you have anything to add on that?
On Sanders? Yeah, not heaps, to be honest. I think the universal healthcare, you know, being such a central demand of Sanders' campaign and like a really inspiring one for a bunch of his supporters, it's just so obviously vindicated right now in terms of just how blatantly unequal, divided, disgraceful the situation is, particularly in New York, where you're seeing thousands upon thousands of people die, overwhelmingly Black and Latino people, of course. But I think like stopping at universal healthcare sets your sights just so low. Like most of the developed world has universal healthcare, and it's a disaster and a nightmare. You know, nurses and doctors speaking out in Australian hospitals, which, you know, are relatively, compared to the States, well-funded, have better staff than America at least. And they have been saying for months that they are woefully underprepared for the crisis that is coming. So if you stop your sights in America at just getting up to the rest of the world, when it is that the rest of the world is just facing like the scale of disaster unseen never before, you know, or better welfare services. You know, America has a particularly brutal social security system, but every social security system in the world right now, with millions upon millions of people unemployed, is, you know, feeling the brunt, crippling people, you know, humiliating people in this time of just like absolute devastation. So I think you need to go much further than Sanders' proposals, essentially, even though they would be a good start and very much needed in America right now.
Okay, cool. Well, we might move on more to talk a little bit more generally about democratic socialism. For people who are just tuning in, friends and comrades, we're talking about socialism, getting into detail about what it actually is, what kind of society we in Socialist Alternative are trying to fight for. If you're interested in being more involved in our organisation during the lockdown and beyond, please sign up to receive updates and details about how to get involved. The link to that is posted in the video description, as is a link to the Marxism discussion groups, which run every Monday and Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and also every Saturday at 2 p.m. also Eastern Standard Time, because we're prejudiced in that way, sorry. And you can zoom into those discussions. They're hosted on Zoom, but we divide into small groups so that you can get all your questions answered, and they deal with a number of different topics. So we actually have one session dedicated to the capitalist state and looking at what that actually consists of. We have sessions about the working class, the question of revolution, I guess the frequently asked questions that people who are becoming interested in socialist politics have, and the discussion format gives us a chance to go into those in a bit of depth. So we've just discussed the Sanders campaign narrowly, but I guess it's a good place to move it on to, well, what do we think of democratic socialism, which is sometimes a bit of a fuzzy term, but I think many proponents of it, and it's something that's quite fashionable today, do see themselves, unlike Sanders, as wanting to abolish capitalism, and you know, they have a vision of socialism that is you know, stage beyond capitalism. But what are the limitations, I guess, of the democratic road to socialism, which I think is often better defined as the parliamentary road to socialism?
Yeah, I really agree with that that way of putting it, that it's not really democratic, it's more just parliamentary. Because it's about saying, you know, you want a minority of people, politicians basically, the candidates, to take command of the process. Then the role of the masses is to vote for them, donate to their campaigns, and possibly go out and door knock for them and just generally build up support for them, but not to introduce socialism themselves. So it's more about really a minority approach to socialism, where there's a small group of people that will be in the positions of responsibility that will introduce it on our behalf. There's a great, if anyone's watching this, well, hopefully someone is, if you're watching this, there's an absolute classic text that you should read. It's online. It's by Hal Draper. It's called Two Souls of Socialism. He's got a really good approach to this, because he basically says, all through the history of the socialist movement, there's been two approaches to how to get rid of capitalism, change society. One is based on having a minority do it, from above, as it were. So that could mean a minority of politicians elected into parliament, you know, or a president, 200 people in Congress, whatever. Could mean a minority of people taking up arms and launching a coup and installing a dictatorship that it's enlightened and it's going to, you know, change the world that way. That's one system. But then the other system is socialism, as he puts it, from below. And that's what we've been talking about already. You know, workers struggling, building up their struggles into a mass movement until it can finally topple the whole system, challenge the, you know, the powers that be now. And the reason that socialism from below is better and superior is it's the only thing that can work to really create a new society, for the reason that Karl Marx put it. You know, Karl Marx said there's two reasons you need a revolution. Number one, and this is the reason most people know, because the people that are in charge of an exploiting class society won't go peacefully. They won't go voluntarily. They won't just give up because you won an election, for example. You think about the things capitalists do and the politicians that serve them. The fact that you win some election doesn't mean they're going to let you get rid of capitalism. Far from it. Okay, that's one reason you need a revolution. But the other reason, in a way the more important one, I think, is that the working class, the poor, the oppressed, but especially the working class, they've got to go through a process of the revolution to learn about their capacity to reorganize society. You know, you go on strike once, twice, 10 times. You learn not only how to beat the boss, but you learn that you can beat the boss. You learn that you can cooperate with other workers at a bigger and bigger scale. And as those things build up, you learn more that, yeah, you can run society. And one of the biggest problems of capitalism is that it teaches the oppressed that the way they live is natural, that there's no way that, you know, millions of people could actively participate in organizing society. But that's what socialism is. It's millions of people actively participating in organizing society. And the only way you're going to get to that is through mass struggle, not through a minority taking charge on their behalf. And that's why, number one thing you can say empirically about the parliamentary approach to socialism is they've tried it almost everywhere and it doesn't work. It's probably the most tested method in politics on the left in all of history. What if we run an election? Like in America, they do it every 2 years. You know, in most countries, every 2 years. Like, what if we try to introduce socialism by running in elections? And they failed at every point. You know, Sanders has failed at a really early point, didn't even get the nomination 2 times running before he's endorsed this extreme right-winger, basically, Joe Biden, classic neoliberal embodiment of the establishment. But the problem with parliamentary socialism isn't that they lose at that point. Like, that's kind of lame, but they lose at the further points as well. They can win the election, they can win the majority, they can come up with the great acts of legislation, but they can't create a society that is based on anything other than bureaucratic methods of control, because that's what parliament is. That's what the capitalist state is, actually. So what happens is you just get absorbed into the system rather than creating another one. That's why it's such a thoroughly tested and consistently failed method, I think.
Yeah, I think that thing of those who've tried to transform the state in the past have more commonly become the next kind of set of responsible managers of capitalism is just so true. And you can see that all across Europe right now with kind of social democratic parties that have sold out essentially and have lost a lot of credibility over the years because they became, the managers of capitalism, the kind of introducers of neoliberalism. In Australia, the Labor Party was the, bringers of neoliberalism to the country. Formerly, there were socialists who, would intervene into the Labor Party, thought that it could be transformed, but those people were deluded. I think the kind of central, I guess, kind of proposal here is that the state is not a neutral tool to be wielded by kind of people with the right ideas or someone who's got the right kind of socialist proposal for how you could go forward. The problem isn't that like the people who've tried before are like bad guys or like have, you know, weakness in some way or another, and they weren't able to kind of take on the kind of questions required. There's something objective about the state itself as a weapon and as the key body for the enforcement of capitalism. That means that, you know, people who seek to change it through the system get sucked up into it. And that's if you even get there and, you know, at the end point. How difficult is it to, you know, participate in the so-called democracy that we have under capitalism? Elections are a sham. You know, even to get on the ballot paper is a hurdle enough. You know, if you want to run in kind of any, you know, capitalist developed country around the world, there's like usually two parties. You have to fight those parties as well if it is that you want to be the candidate. So I think democratic socialists say that you have to be realistic and say that the realistic thing is to try and wield the capitalist state to your own interests. But really, if you look at history, that is just so obviously totally unrealistic. The state very much can come in at any point to back up the interests of capitalism. Like the obvious example in Australia is Gough Whitlam, who was like not a socialist by any stretch really, and was seeking to cut back on a lot of the kind of reforms that he previously implemented. But the capitalist class nonetheless had no qualms about just bringing in the Queen's representative to sack him. It's a total disgrace and totally undemocratic. So I think to say that you can transform the system as well is to accept the kind of premise that we do live in a democracy. Elections are like representative of the people, because I think Parliament is really just a facade over what is generally a very undemocratic, you know, dictatorship of capitalism, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only way that parliamentary socialism is in any sense actually realistic is in the way that it matches the reality of the powerlessness that people feel today. There's a naturalization of powerlessness. The masses of people out there being exploited and oppressed by the system do not feel that they can govern it, that they can take control of it. But to lose sight of that and to just settle for reforms within the capitalist system is, I think, the most pessimistic view of socialism that you could possibly have. And revolutionary socialists are defined by the opposite, I guess, that we put store in the activity and the struggle of millions and millions of oppressed people the world over to actually build the socialist society that we're fighting for. So I think we should talk about that a little bit, because revolution can seem like a distant prospect today, but it's absolutely core to how we would actually get from the point we're at today to a point where people across the board are democratically in control of their own lives, the economy, politics, and everything else. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about what makes revolution so necessary for socialists.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, Lily. Yeah, go for it.
Well, I really agree with that point. I think kind of thinking that you can just kind of change the system from within really accepts like the common logic of politics, which is that it all happens in and around the state, and that's where all power is derived from. But in reality, I think power under capitalism comes from class and class power and how your class is organized. Like the capitalist class, you know, use a variety of means to instill their rule. But also, like, our power really is in the streets. And if it is that you want to win reforms or win anything really, like, look to history, and the only way we've won is by fighting and organizing directly, not, you know, making compromises with the system or seeking to kind of conciliate along the way, but by being at loggerheads with it and trying to fight against it and every kind of manifestation of oppression and horror. So rather than saying what we need to do is find some way to, make amends with the system, instead, I think to win reforms, you have to be a revolutionary and push and rebel at every point that you can. But yeah, why stop there as well? Any reform that you make can be pushed back upon by capitalists who constantly want to undermine and, further exploit us, suppress us to seek more profit. So I think that revolution is necessary, I guess because it's impossible to transform the state, but also because every reform that we can win can always be pushed back, and they're always going to want to push further and further on us. And it's possible as well, all of the attacks that the capitalists could wage, say you're a socialist prime minister, Sarah, and you're trying to change the way that things run. Potentially, America could invade, the country of Sarah, the state of Sarah, and we would have to organize some way to fight back against that. But that would be pretty difficult, I guess, if it's just you and maybe me and Daniel as well. On the contrary, if it was that there was a revolutionary process underway, and people were organizing in their workplaces and trying to take back power, I suppose, I think you could see how it could be that actually every kind of move that the capitalists make depends upon this kind of hidden structure of consent and people working. If it is that consent is removed and people stop the flow of production, then all of the power of the capitalist class falls away totally. So communication workers, if it were the case that we're in a revolutionary process of some kind, could stop the flow of communication between the attacking capitalist army, could say, well, we refuse to send your text messages, we're going to shut down the internet. At strikes at Sydney Uni that I've been involved in the past, it has been the case that IT workers have said we're not going to operate any of the computer systems, and that has really effectively shut down the university. Or if it is the case that we're in some kind of huge struggle as well, imagine just how many workers there are that just make the whole system move at every turn. Hotel workers could just say, well, we're not going to host anyone who doesn't support the side of socialism. That would really hurt the cause of people who are trying to attack us as well. So I think that kind of that kind of power is really necessary to wield against the system and push it back. But I think as well, I'm sure Daniel can talk about this more, but the kind of depth of the process of social change that you were talking about in terms of the self-emancipation and kind of reversal of capitalism, tipping it on its head, means that it just can't be a strategy that's implemented from on high, and really requires this process of people themselves taking hold of things. It requires people learning those lessons from shutting down communications and hotels and stuff to be able to then create a society that's based on ordinary people's control of the world.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, it is one of the injustices of capitalism that we don't talk about often enough, that the state of Donald Trump is infinitely more powerful than the state of Sarah.
So true.
Another reason to add to the list, overthrow the system. Okay, well, we don't have time for much more, so I'm going to bring Daniel in to round us off with any further comments he wants to make about revolution and its necessity in fighting for socialism, but also what we're doing today in Socialist Alternative to build towards that vision. As I said before, it can sometimes seem, I think, quite distant, the prospect of revolution, though it's not. Most people watching in their lifetimes will have lived through, probably happening in other countries and so on, but nevertheless lived through several revolutions. They're quite a common occurrence, but they can seem distant when they're not actually happening, and they can certainly seem removed from the kind of day-to-day work that socialists do. So, Daniel, why don't you talk a bit about the relationship between those things?
Yeah, totally. I think every socialist, as part of being a socialist, is not just, you got to denounce the injustice of capitalism and all the things ruling class do wrong. You got to study revolutions and the struggles of the oppressed, because that's where you're going to see the future of humanity. From a socialist point of view, a mass movement and a revolution is a future way of organising society that's kind of breaking through into the world that we live in now. And so that means in those movements, that's where you see human beings at their absolute best, the most cooperative, the most creative, the most confident, all of the things that grind us down day to day, they get broken down in the process of that kind of a mass movement. So you've got to study it if you want to see whether this stuff is possible. And everyone knows that 2020 has kind of sucked so far. There's a little while left to run on it. It hasn't been a great start to the year. But what less people know is that 2019 was great. 2019 was like one of the best years in history because there were mass movements that broke out of that nature all around the world. You know, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, you know, Chile, Lebanon, Hong Kong, France. There were all different kinds of street movements, mass movements. Sudan, Algeria, actually the ones that started it off, some of the most important ones. And you saw every element of this breaking out in these movements as people came together and tried to figure out how we're going to reconstruct society together, because we believe that we can do it. There's so many of us here, we're doing it together. Surely it's got to be possible. And you see the creativity of it, people believing so much stuff is possible when they put in a curfew, a silence curfew in Chile, and you had opera singers going onto their balconies to sing leftist songs in defiance of that. And you had actually incredible musical stuff came up over the course of it in these mass gatherings in Chile to sing songs that had been, you know, really represented the struggle against right-wing neoliberal dictatorship, and, you know, songs of people that have been murdered by fascists and so on, and hundreds of thousands of people singing them together. That kind of creativity, that kind of cooperation. Or in the strike wave in France, when there was the opera was on strike and they were performing like Swan Lake and stuff with all these ballet dancers for all these striking workers, blue-collar workers. But there's other kinds of creativity too, like in Sudan, when the striking workers in a power plant laid out their helmets on the ground to take a photo of the slogan calling for civilian rather than military rule. That's creativity as well. Or when I was extremely lucky to be in France during the part of the strike wave. I probably won't be allowed out of my house until there's a workers' revolution. So it's nice that I got that trip in recently. And, you know, you could talk to these rail workers that are coordinating every day. They know the union bureaucracy might sell out the movement. So they're trying to figure out every day, how can we build the rank and file participation, the workers' participation? These were socialist rail workers organizing this. That's creativity too. You know, that's kind of the daring and cooperative creativity that you get in a mass movement. That's like the future society emerging. So people you gotta read, like we have a section on our website actually on Red Flag that's revolts and uprisings. And the point of it isn't just to like celebrate chaos like a Batman villain. It's to say that, you know, these kinds of events are talked about in the mainstream press as like an inconvenience. Oh no, there's all these people protesting, or that's kind of weird, or everyone's on strike, this is annoying. If you know how to look at them and if you know the potential they represent, you understand them totally differently. And we're trying to draw attention to that as part of, you know, what it means to, I guess, be a socialist and prove the possibility that there's another way, that there is a way to challenge the system instead of just relying on people to do it for us. There's a great movie actually people should watch. It's called The Factory. It's on Al Jazeera. You can watch it online. It's about how the Egyptian revolution started. Gives you a good sense of how revolutions work as well. But the thing is, like all of these movements so far have not yet been successful. Like if I say the Egyptian revolution, then most people think of that as something that ended in defeat, and it did. And none of these movements have yet managed to overthrow capitalism. And, you know, that's why we're in this mess now. And that's because the other aspect you need of it is you need a revolutionary socialist current in those movements that can say, this movement can begin as trying to get, you know, more equality, more democracy, whatever. But if you look at the reality of what we're doing now in the streets, in the workplaces, as we strike, as we organise, if you look at what that means we have the capacity actually to reconstruct society this way. That's what revolutionary socialists can contribute to those movements, to give them the confidence and the strategies to go on and challenge the capitalists, to take on the task that can seem like a really difficult task that people need the confidence to do, of reconstructing society in a totally different way. So we've got to set to work now. There's a big crisis of capitalism on all around the world. We've got to set to work putting those organisations together so that they can enter into and take part in and participate in and collaborate with those revolutionary movements, but also make sure that they don't get defeated and they actually get to do what they're capable of doing, which is overturning society and creating a new type of organising human existence. So we're trying to do that in Socialist Alternative. That's why, you know, we put on things like this. We have our Marxism discussion groups to explain to people, I guess, more of the theoretical background about it. We have our theoretical journal, Marxist Left Review. We've got our newspaper, but we also, you know, we've been leading a lot of trade union work where we can. If you've seen in the news, actually, people might have seen there's a big controversy in the university sector. A lot of trade unionists have been fighting against some of the government attacks there. We've been heavily involved in organising that. Similarly, the teachers fighting, you know, around school closures and so on. trying to organise working class resistance in the here and now, so that we can build up the confidence of the oppressed, build up the confidence of the workers, and hopefully help contribute to that kind of movement developing. So you've got to get organised if you believe in this stuff. That's what. So we've put together our group basically to help people get organised in whatever way they're able to do it, they want to do it, whether it starts from just learning more about Marxism or ends through, hopefully international working class revolution, if that's what you're into. So yeah, hopefully get in touch with us. Hopefully we can help you get on that path.
Awesome. Well, as far as hot takes for surviving ISO go, I think that building a stronger socialist movement is pretty much high up there, the best hot take I've seen. So definitely, if you want to find out more about all of that, again, click onto the how to get involved link that's linked in the video description. And someone will get in touch with you about the events happening in your state, but also on Zoom, accessible wherever you are, as well as the Marxism discussion groups. In particular, I'm plugging them tonight because I think they're going to be a really useful follow-up from the forum that we've just concluded, which was really just a teaser for all of these topics. What does socialism look like? What do we say about the question of reforms versus revolution? All of that is discussed at length and at the pace that you desire in the Marxism discussion groups. All of your questions will be answered there. So definitely get along to those. I also want to recommend that people tune in next Sunday for the next forum, which is about climate change and capitalism. So we're going off the map a little bit. We're not so much going to be talking about the COVID-19 crisis, but talking more generally about the question of climate change. As Daniel mentioned early on in this forum, climate destruction is something that's baked into capitalism as very much part of its DNA. And I think that to really fight for a planet that's worth living on and that we're capable of living on, that's inseparable from the fight for socialism. So we'll be talking about what socialists argue the way forward is for the movement to take on climate change. So for all of you out there who maybe before isolation were involved in some of the huge climate strikes and other climate activism, this is we're going back in time to when that was one of the central issues being discussed, and we're going to talk about it because it's one issue that's not going away, unfortunately. And we're still going to have to be hitting the streets and fighting for a clean climate once this is over. So yeah, definitely tune in for that. I think people find it really, really interesting. And apart from that, thanks again, comrades, for your excellent contributions. It was really worthwhile discussion, I think.
Thanks, Sarah. It was great fun. Thanks, Lily.
Yeah. And everyone now should join the post-Zoom discussions. So again, the links for those are in the video description. Just log on and yeah, we can continue to discuss these issues that we just started to touch on: revolution, socialism. We've got a world to win. So thanks everyone. See you all next week.